Ethan had always thought of himself as an ordinary man. He worked quietly as a scientist at a remote observatory, spending his nights staring at the stars. To him, the universe was a puzzle, and he was one of the many trying to fit the pieces together. But on this particular evening, as the cold wind howled outside and the hum of his equipment filled the room, something extraordinary happened. The signal came unexpectedly. At first, it looked like random static on his screen. Ethan leaned closer, narrowing his eyes. The patterns weren't random, they were deliberate. Someone, or something, was trying to communicate. His heart raced as he adjusted the settings, filtering out the noise. The signal became clearer, and soon, it transformed into a series of strange symbols and sounds. "What in the world?" Ethan muttered to himself. He grabbed his notebook and began to jot down the sequence, his hands trembling. This wasn't just any transmission. It was intelligent, calculated, and ancient. There was something almost melodic about it, as though it carried a message meant to be heard, not just analyzed. Hours turned into the early morning as Ethan worked tirelessly to decode the signal. He barely noticed the growing ache in his back or the empty coffee cups piling up on his desk. Slowly, the message began to take shape. It wasn't written in any known language, but it had similarities to Earth's myths and legends. Ethan's mind raced with connections he couldn't fully understand yet. Finally, the pieces clicked together. The decoded message wasn't just an invitation. It was a call to action. It mentioned a meeting, a place deep in the Amazon rainforest, far from civilization. And it spoke of a woman, but not an ordinary one. The message described her as an alien, yet strangely familiar. She was part of a race called the Eldarian, a species that resembled the elves of human mythology. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the glowing screen. "Elves? Seriously," he muttered, rubbing his temples. He felt like he was being pulled into a fantasy story, one that was impossible to believe. Yet the evidence was right there in front of him. As he read further, the message revealed something that sent chills down his spine. The meeting wasn't just for him. It was for the survival of Earth. The Eldarian had been watching humanity for centuries, guiding them in subtle ways. But now, they needed someone to step forward, someone who could prove that humans were worth saving. Ethan wasn't sure why the message had come to him, but the weight of it settled heavily on his shoulders. "I'm just a scientist," he whispered to himself. "Why me?" The answer, of course, wasn't in the message. Ethan realized he wouldn't get any more answers unless he went to the meeting point. But the thought of traveling to a remote rainforest, chasing what could be nothing more than a bizarre prank, made him hesitate. He thought about calling his colleagues, maybe even the authorities. But a part of him, a deep, curious part, stopped him. If this was real, then it was the discovery of a lifetime. If it wasn't, he could simply return home, embarrassed, but no worse off. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than him, bigger than anything he'd ever encountered. His mind buzzed with questions. Who were the Eldarian, really? Why did they look like the elves of Earth's myths? And why did they choose now to reach out? As the first rays of sunlight peeked through the window, Ethan made his decision. He packed a small bag, filling it with essentials: food, water, a map, his notebook, and his portable equipment. He couldn't explain it, but he felt a strange pull, as though the stars themselves were urging him forward. By the time he locked the door to the observatory, the morning sky was ablaze with light. Ethan stood for a moment, gazing upward. The universe suddenly felt much larger, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the brink of something extraordinary. Taking a deep breath, he whispered to himself, "Guess I'm meeting an alien elf woman." With that, Ethan began his journey, unaware of how much his life, and perhaps all of humanity, was about to change. Ethan's journey to the Amazon rainforest was anything but easy. The idea of meeting an alien elf woman still felt surreal, but the mysterious message kept playing in his mind. The instructions were precise. He had to travel to a location deep within the jungle, far from any modern civilization. Every mile he covered brought him closer to answers, and perhaps more questions. After hours of flights and a bumpy ride in an old jeep, Ethan found himself staring at a dense wall of trees. The air was thick with humidity, and the sounds of insects buzzed around him. His guide, a local man named Manuel, handed him a machete and gestured toward the jungle. "This is as far as I go," Manuel said. "You're sure you don't want to tell me why you're out here?" Ethan smiled nervously. "Just research. Thanks for the help." Manuel shook his head but didn't press further. "Be careful out there. The jungle doesn't forgive mistakes." Ethan nodded and adjusted the strap of his backpack. With the machete in hand, he stepped into the dense undergrowth. The further he walked, the quieter it became. The sounds of the jeep and Manuel's voice faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. The coordinates from the message were loaded into his portable GPS device, but even with the technology guiding him, Ethan felt uneasy. The jungle was alive, yet it felt almost watchful, as though it knew he didn't belong. Hours passed, and the journey became more challenging. He had to cross small streams, climb over fallen trees, and push through thorny bushes. Sweat dripped down his face, and his arms ached from cutting through the dense vegetation. But Ethan pressed on, driven by the thought that he was walking toward something extraordinary. As the sun began to set, the atmosphere changed. The jungle, once alive with sound, grew eerily quiet. Ethan checked his GPS. He was close. His pulse quickened as he spotted a clearing ahead. Stepping into the open space, Ethan froze. In the middle of the clearing stood something that didn't belong. A massive, shimmering structure that seemed to hum with energy. It wasn't made of metal or stone. It looked like a living crystal, glowing faintly in the dim light. Ethan approached cautiously, his heart pounding. The structure pulsed with a soft rhythm, like a heartbeat. He reached out to touch it, but before his fingers could make contact, the air around him shimmered. Suddenly, a portal materialized before him. It was circular, swirling with colors that defied description. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the gateway described in the message. For a moment, he hesitated. The portal was both beautiful and terrifying. What if this was a trap? What if stepping through meant never coming back? But deep down, Ethan knew he couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. The world around him seemed to blur, and a strange warmth enveloped him. Then, just as quickly as it started, it was over. Ethan found himself in a place that didn't belong on Earth. The sky was a deep shade of violet, dotted with 3 glowing moons. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the scent of flowers he'd never seen before. Bioluminescent plants glowed softly in the darkness, and strange creatures darted through the trees. And then he saw her. Standing at the edge of a glowing pond was a figure unlike anything Ethan had ever imagined. She was tall and slender, with skin that shimmered like silver under the moons. Her hair flowed like liquid gold, and her eyes, large, almond-shaped, and glowing faintly, seemed to pierce through him. Ethan's breath caught as he realized she was exactly as the message described. An alien, yet unmistakably similar to the elves of Earth's legends. She turned to face him, her expression calm but curious. When she spoke, her voice was melodic, almost hypnotic. "You are Ethan," she said. It wasn't a question. She already knew. Ethan swallowed hard, struggling to find his voice. Yes. And you're?" "I am Eloria," she replied, her gaze steady. "You have come, as I hoped you would." Ethan took a hesitant step forward. "I got your message." What do you need from me?" Eloria's expression softened, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Not just me, my people, and perhaps yours as well." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He had stepped into a world far beyond anything he had ever known, and somehow he knew his journey was just beginning. Ethan stood frozen as Eloria approached him. Every step she took seemed almost weightless, as if the ground itself welcomed her presence. Up close, she looked even more extraordinary. Her features were delicate yet powerful, her gaze both warm and piercing. "You've traveled far," Eloria said, her voice carrying a soothing tone that made Ethan's racing heart slow. Ethan nodded, struggling to find the right words. I didn't know if the message was real, but here I am." "It is real," Eloria replied, tilting her head slightly. "And so are the dangers that brought you here." Her words sent a ripple of unease through Ethan. "Dangers? What kind of dangers?" Eloria gestured toward the glowing pond. The water reflected the violet sky, but as Ethan looked closer, he realized it wasn't water at all. The surface shimmered like liquid crystal, and faint images swirled within it, scenes of destruction and chaos. "Our worlds are connected in ways neither of us fully understand," Eloria began. "Long ago, my people, the Eldarian, visited your Earth. We shared knowledge, helped your ancestors grow, and in return, we observed and learned. But then, something changed. Your kind became unpredictable." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Unpredictable? You mean violent?" Eloria gave a small nod. "Yes, we retreated, choosing to watch from afar. But now, a force threatens both our worlds, and it feeds on the very traits that make your kind dangerous: fear, anger, and greed. If left unchecked, it will consume everything." Ethan stared at the swirling images in the pond. The destruction seemed distant, almost abstract, but something about it felt deeply unsettling. "And you think I can help? I'm just a scientist. I'm not a hero or anything like that." Eloria stepped closer, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "You are not here by chance, Ethan. The message reached you because you possess something rare, a mind that questions, a heart that seeks understanding. That is what we need." Ethan's thoughts raced. This all felt too big, too overwhelming. "What exactly do you need me to do?" Eloria extended her hand, palm up. In it, a small glowing crystal materialized. It pulsed gently, as if alive. "This is a fragment of the connection between our worlds. You must protect it. Without it, the balance will break, and the force I spoke of will spread faster." Ethan hesitated before reaching out to take the crystal. The moment his fingers touched it, a surge of warmth spread through him. He felt an odd sense of clarity, as if pieces of a puzzle he didn't know existed were falling into place. "There's more to this, isn't there?" Ethan asked, his voice steadier now. Eloria nodded, her expression growing somber. "The force is not just a threat. It is intelligent. It knows we are trying to stop it, and it will try to destroy you." Ethan's stomach tightened. "Destroy me? Why me?" "Because you carry the crystal now," Eloria said, "and because it knows your kind better than you realize." The weight of the crystal in Ethan's hand felt heavier now. He looked up at Eloria, searching for some reassurance. "What about you? Are you coming with me?" Eloria hesitated for the first time, her gaze shifting to the swirling pond. "I will guide you, but I cannot leave this realm entirely. My connection to it is too strong, but you will not be alone." Before Ethan could ask what she meant, the ground beneath them trembled. The pond's surface rippled violently, and the images within it darkened. A low, guttural sound echoed through the air, sending chills down Ethan's spine. "They know you have the crystal," Eloria said, her voice urgent now. "We must move." Ethan followed her as she led him away from the pond and deeper into the glowing forest. The bioluminescent plants seemed to dim as the guttural sound grew louder, as if the forest itself was afraid. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, his breath quickening. "To a safe point," Eloria replied, "but we must hurry. The force can sense the crystal's energy. If it reaches us before we reach safety." She didn't finish the sentence, but Ethan didn't need her to. The tension in her voice said enough. As they ran, Ethan's mind swirled with questions. What was this force? Why had it chosen now to strike? And why, Out of all the people in the world, was he the one holding the key to stopping it? For now, there were no answers, only the sound of their hurried footsteps and the growing roar of something sinister closing in behind them. Ethan ran as fast as he could, his heart pounding in his chest. The glowing forest around him felt alive, its soft lights flickering as if reacting to the growing threat. Behind him, the guttural roar grew louder, more menacing, like a predator closing in on its prey. Aloria led the way, her movements swift and graceful despite the urgency. She didn't look back, but her voice was calm and firm. "Keep moving, Ethan. We're almost there." Ethan didn't have time to ask where there was. All he knew was that stopping wasn't an option. The crystal in his hand pulsed faintly, its warmth both comforting and unsettling. Whatever it was, it seemed to sense the danger too. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted. Ethan stumbled but managed to stay on his feet. Aloria glanced back for the first time, her glowing eyes filled with determination. "We're being followed. Stay close." Before Ethan could respond, a shadowy figure burst through the trees behind them. It was massive, its form shifting and writhing like smoke, yet its presence was solid and suffocating. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This was no ordinary predator. "What is that?" he shouted. "The force I warned you about," Aloria said, her voice steady despite the urgency. "It's a fragment of the darkness. It wants the crystal. And you." Ethan's grip on the crystal tightened. "Well, it can't have me." The shadow lunged toward them, its smoky tendrils reaching out. Aloria raised her hand, and a shimmering barrier of light erupted between them and the creature. The shadow hissed and recoiled, but the barrier flickered, as if struggling to hold. "Go," Aloria commanded, her voice sharp. "I'll hold it off." Ethan hesitated. "What about you?" "I can handle this," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Trust me." Reluctantly, Ethan nodded and turned to run. Every step felt heavier than the last, but he pushed forward, the crystal's faint glow guiding him. As he moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the battle faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Ethan's surroundings changed. The glowing trees gave way to a clearing, where a massive structure stood. It was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen, a towering spire made of the same shimmering crystal he held in his hand. The crystal in his palm pulsed more intensely now, as if it recognized the spire. Ethan approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. Before he could reach the spire, a voice echoed around him. It wasn't Aloria's voice, but something darker, colder. "Do you think you can escape me, human?" Ethan froze, his heart pounding. The shadowy figure emerged from the forest, moving with unnatural speed. Its form shifted and grew, towering over him. "You are nothing," the shadow hissed, "a fragile creature holding something you cannot comprehend." Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run, but he stood his ground. "I don't know what you are," he said, his voice shaking but defiant. "But I won't let you win." The shadow laughed, a chilling sound that made the air around Ethan grow colder. "You think courage will save you? Foolish." Before Ethan could react, the shadow lunged toward him. But as it closed the distance, the crystal in Ethan's hand flared with a brilliant light. The shadow screamed and recoiled, its form breaking apart like smoke in the wind. Ethan stared at the crystal, its glow now blinding. He felt a surge of energy course through him, as if the crystal was awakening something deep within. Before the shadow could recover, Aloria appeared beside him, her expression fierce. Her hands glowed with the same light as the crystal, and she raised them toward the shadow. "It's time to end this." Together, Aloria and the crystal unleashed a wave of energy that enveloped the shadow. The creature let out a final, ear-piercing scream before it dissolved into nothingness. The forest grew quiet once more, the tension in the air lifting. Aloria turned to Ethan, her expression softening. "You did well." Ethan shook his head, still catching his breath. I don't even know what I did. The crystal responds to your will, Eloria explained. It chose you for a reason. Ethan stared at the glowing crystal in his hand, a mix of awe and fear in his eyes. What happens now? Eloria looked toward the spire. Now we prepare. This was only the beginning. The true battle lies ahead. Ethan nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. Whatever was coming, he knew there was no turning back. Ethan stared at the towering crystal spire, its surface shimmering in the faint light of the alien moons. The glowing object in his hand pulsed softly, its energy resonating with the massive structure before him. Eloria stood beside him, her expression unreadable, but her gaze fixed on the spire. "What is this place?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is the core nexus," Eloria replied. "It connects my world to yours. It is the heart of the balance we must protect." Ethan glanced at her, confused. "Protect from what? We just fought off that thing. Isn't it over?" Eloria turned to face him, her glowing eyes serious. "That shadow was only a fragment of the force I warned you about. The true threat is still coming, and it will stop at nothing to destroy the connection between our worlds." Ethan felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. He looked back at the spire, its glow intensifying as the crystal in his hand pulsed in sync. "And this?" he asked, holding up the crystal. "What does it do?" "The crystal is a key," Eloria explained. "It can either strengthen the nexus or destroy it, depending on how it is used. That is why the Force wants it. It seeks to sever the link between our worlds, ensuring it can consume both without resistance." Ethan swallowed hard. "And I'm supposed to stop that. I'm just a guy with no training in any of this." "You are more capable than you realize," Eloria said, her voice firm but kind. "The crystal chose you for a reason. Your decisions will shape what happens next." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't sure how he ended up as the protector of some interdimensional artifact, but here he was. "What do we do now?" Eloria motioned toward the spire. "The nexus must be fortified. That is the only way to ensure it can withstand the coming assault. But doing so will not be easy. It requires energy, and the process will draw attention." "Attention from who?" Ethan asked, already dreading the answer. "The Force has agents," Eloria replied. "Beings corrupted by its influence. They will come for us once we begin. That is why we must be ready." Ethan's grip on the crystal tightened. "Ready how? I don't exactly have a weapon or any training in fighting alien shadows." Eloria smiled faintly. "You have something far more valuable. Your mind. The crystal responds to your thoughts and intentions. With focus, you can channel its energy to protect yourself and the Nexus." "That's a lot of pressure," Ethan muttered, but he nodded. "Okay, let's do this." Eloria stepped toward the spire, her hands glowing faintly as she began to chant in a language Ethan couldn't understand. The air around them grew warmer, and the spire pulsed with light, sending ripples of energy into the ground. The crystal in Ethan's hand glowed brighter, almost as if it was alive. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the clearing. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and Ethan turned to see dark shapes emerging from the forest. His heart sank as he realized what they were. "They're here," he said, his voice shaking. Eloria didn't stop her chanting. "Hold them off, Ethan. You can do this." Ethan's mind raced as the corrupted figures drew closer. They were humanoid but twisted, their bodies covered in dark, swirling energy. Their eyes glowed red, and their movements were jerky and unnatural. He looked down at the crystal, its light pulsating in his palm. "Focus," he muttered to himself. "You can do this." As the first creature lunged at him, Ethan raised the crystal instinctively. A burst of light shot out, striking the creature and sending it flying backward. Ethan stared at the glowing crystal, both shocked and relieved. "Okay, that's cool," he said, a nervous grin on his face. More creatures charged at him, their guttural growls filling the air. Ethan focused on the crystal, willing it to protect him. Beams of light erupted from his hand, creating a barrier around the spire. The corrupted beings slammed against it, hissing and clawing, but they couldn't break through. Aloria's chanting grew louder, and the spire's glow intensified. The energy in the air was almost overwhelming, and Ethan could feel the crystal vibrating in his hand. But the attackers didn't stop. For every one Ethan repelled, two more seemed to appear. He was starting to feel the strain, his body trembling from the effort of controlling the crystal's power. "Aloria," he shouted, "I can't hold them off forever." "Just a little longer," she replied, her voice steady but urgent. "The nexus is almost stable." Ethan gritted his teeth, pouring every ounce of focus into the crystal. The light around the spire grew brighter, and the creatures recoiled, their forms flickering as if they were being burned by the energy. Finally, with a final surge of power, Aloria's chanting stopped. The spire released a blinding pulse of light, and the corrupted beings let out ear-piercing screams before disintegrating into nothingness. Ethan collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. The crystal in his hand dimmed, its energy stabilizing. Aloria approached him, her expression both relieved and proud. "You did it," she said softly. Ethan looked up at her, exhausted but alive. "We did it. But what now?" Aloria glanced at the spire, its glow now steady and strong. "Now we prepare for what's next. This was only the beginning." Ethan nodded, realizing that his journey was far from over. Ethan leaned against the crystal spire, catching his breath. His arms felt like lead, and his legs wobbled beneath him. The weight of everything, the battle, the crystal's power, the growing threat, pressed heavily on him. He looked at Aloria, her calm demeanor unshaken, though a faint glow in her skin had dimmed from the effort of stabilizing the nexus. "Is it over?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. Aloria shook her head. "For now, we have time to regroup, but this was only a skirmish. The force will strike again, and it will come back stronger." Ethan frowned, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Why does it keep coming? Why now? And why us? Aloria's glowing eyes softened, a mix of understanding and sorrow in her gaze. "The force thrives on imbalance. For centuries, the connection between our worlds was weak, almost forgotten. But your kind has advanced, and our worlds are becoming intertwined again. The force sees this as an opportunity to consume everything." Ethan rubbed his temples. "So we're just unlucky enough to be in its way?" "No," Aloria replied firmly. "We are the only ones capable of stopping it. Together." Ethan wanted to argue, to push back against the responsibility that had been thrust upon him, but he couldn't. Deep down, he knew she was right. If they didn't act, no one else would. As the silence stretched between them, Aloria moved closer to the spire, placing her hand on its surface. The crystal pulsed faintly, responding to her touch. "The nexus is stable for now, but it will not hold indefinitely. We must find a way to strengthen it further." Ethan watched her, the faint glow of the spire reflecting in her silver skin. "How do we do that?" Aloria turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "The crystal you carry is powerful, but it is only one piece of a greater whole. Long ago, my people divided the Nexus's energy into 3 fragments. One remains here, and one is with you. But the third, it was lost." "Lost?" Ethan repeated, frowning. "Lost where?" She hesitated, her voice quieter now. "On Earth. My people entrusted it to your ancestors, believing they would protect it. But time and war have buried it in the shadows of your history. We must find it." Ethan let out a slow breath, the enormity of their task sinking in. "You're saying we need to search Earth for some ancient alien artifact while fighting off shadow creatures. That's not exactly comforting." Aloria gave him a faint smile. "I never said it would be easy." Ethan chuckled dryly, despite himself. "Fair enough. Do you at least have any idea where to start?" Aloria nodded. The fragment is likely hidden in a place of great significance to your people, somewhere tied to myths or legends, much like the stories of elves and magic that echo our existence. Ethan's mind raced. Myths and legends, like ancient temples or ruins. Exactly, Aloria said. The fragment's energy would have influenced those who lived near it. They would have built monuments or told stories about its power. Ethan thought for a moment. I might have a lead. There's a site in Europe, an old stone circle, where people have claimed strange energy readings for years. It's been written off as a natural phenomenon. But what if it's not? Aloria's eyes brightened slightly. Then we must go there. Ethan sighed, standing upright. His body still ached, but he forced himself to focus. All right, how do we get back to Earth? Aloria stepped away from the spire, her hand glowing faintly as she gestured toward the ground. A circular portal began to form, swirling with soft light. The Nexus can open the way, but be warned, returning to Earth will not be safe. The Force will sense our movement and try to stop us. Ethan tightened his grip on the crystal. I'm getting used to things not being safe. As the portal stabilized, Aloria reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Remember, Ethan, the crystal responds to your will. If your resolve falters, so will its power. Ethan met her gaze, a mixture of determination and fear in his eyes. I'll do my best. Together, they stepped through the portal, the swirling light enveloping them. For a moment, everything felt weightless, as if they were floating between worlds. Then, with a jarring rush, they emerged on the other side. Ethan staggered slightly, blinking against the sunlight. They were in a vast field, the ancient stone circle standing silently before them. The air was crisp, and the world seemed eerily peaceful. But that peace didn't last. The sky darkened, and the familiar roar of the shadows echoed across the landscape. They're here, Aloria said, her voice steady but urgent. Protect the fragment. We cannot fail. Ethan nodded, raising the crystal as the first shadowy figures emerged. The fight was far from over. Let me know your thoughts, or if you'd like adjustments. Ethan tightened his grip on the crystal as shadowy figures began emerging from the darkened sky, their forms twisting and writhing unnaturally. The peaceful field around the ancient stone circle now seemed like a battlefield waiting to erupt. Beside him, Aloria stood tall, her glowing eyes fixed on the approaching threat. They're faster this time, Ethan muttered, his pulse racing. And there's more of them. Aloria nodded, her voice calm despite the urgency. The Force is growing desperate. It knows we are close to finding the final fragment. The shadows moved like liquid, their tendrils stretching toward Ethan and Aloria. Ethan raised the crystal instinctively, and it responded with a pulse of light. A barrier formed around them, shimmering with energy. The first shadow slammed into it, recoiling with an ear-piercing hiss. How long can this barrier hold? Ethan asked, sweat dripping down his face. As long as your resolve remains strong, Aloria replied. But we cannot stay defensive. The fragment is within the circle. We must retrieve it before the shadows overwhelm us. Ethan glanced toward the center of the stone circle. It looked empty at first, just a patch of grass surrounded by ancient stones. But as he focused, he noticed something, an object half buried in the ground, glowing faintly. The final fragment. There, Ethan shouted, pointing. Aloria followed his gaze and nodded. Go. I'll hold them off. What? No way. Ethan protested. You can't take on all of them by yourself. You have the crystal, Aloria said firmly. It is the key to retrieving the fragment. I will buy you the time you need. Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding. He hated the idea of leaving her to fight alone, but he knew she was right. The crystal pulsed in his hand, urging him forward. Okay, he said reluctantly. Be careful. Aloria gave him a faint smile. And you, Ethan. With that, Ethan sprinted toward the center of the stone circle. The shadows hissed and lunged at him, but the crystal's light shielded him, pushing them back just enough for him to move. Behind him, Eloria raised her hands, unleashing bursts of radiant energy that scattered the attacking creatures. As Ethan reached the fragment, he dropped to his knees, digging frantically into the ground. The object was small, about the size of his palm, and pulsed with the same energy as the crystal he carried. The moment he touched it, a surge of warmth shot through him, and the two fragments began to glow brighter together. "I've got it," Ethan shouted, holding up the fragment. But his victory was short-lived. The ground beneath him trembled, and a deep, guttural roar echoed across the field. Ethan turned to see a massive shadow rising from the earth, towering over the stone circle. It was different from the smaller creatures, more solid, more terrifying. Eloria's expression darkened. The Force has sent its champion. Ethan, combine the fragments. Now. Ethan fumbled with the crystal and the fragment in his hands. They seemed to pull toward each other, their energy merging. As they joined, a brilliant light erupted, forcing the shadows to recoil. The champion roared, its massive form lunging toward Ethan. Eloria stepped between them, summoning a shield of light to block the attack. The force of the impact sent shockwaves through the air, but the shield held. "Ethan," Eloria called, her voice strained. "The Nexus. Use the fragments to strengthen the connection." Ethan's mind raced. He could feel the combined energy of the fragments coursing through him, powerful yet overwhelming. He turned toward the stone circle, realizing that it wasn't just a relic. It was a conduit, a part of the Nexus. He raised the fragments above his head, focusing all his will on them. "Come on," he muttered. "Work." The fragments pulsed together, releasing a beam of light that shot into the sky. The energy connected with the dark clouds, cutting through the shadows and illuminating the battlefield. The smaller creatures screamed and dissolved, their forms unable to withstand the light. But the champion was still standing. It roared again, its tendrils thrashing wildly. Eloria struggled to hold her shield, her strength waning. "I need more time," Ethan shouted, pouring all his focus into the Nexus. The stone circle began to glow, its ancient carvings lighting up with energy. The ground trembled, and the connection between the fragments and the circle grew stronger. The champion lunged again, this time breaking through Eloria's shield. She cried out, collapsing to the ground. Ethan's heart sank, but he didn't let go of the fragments. The light around him intensified, and the Nexus responded, unleashing a wave of energy that struck the champion directly. The massive shadow let out a final deafening scream before it dissolved into nothingness. The field grew silent, the air still. Ethan dropped to his knees, gasping for breath. The fragments in his hands dimmed, their energy stabilizing. He turned to see Eloria lying on the ground, her glow faint but still present. He crawled to her side, his hands trembling. "Eloria, are you okay?" She opened her eyes slowly, a faint smile on her lips. "You did it, Ethan. The Nexus is restored." Ethan helped her sit up, relief washing over him. But he knew the fight wasn't over yet. The Force had been weakened, but its presence still lingered. "What now?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. Eloria looked at him, her eyes filled with hope. "Now, we prepare for the final battle." Ethan stood with Eloria, their breaths heavy in the stillness that followed the battle. The stone circle pulsed faintly with energy, the fragments in Ethan's hands dimming to a steady glow. The champion was gone, but Ethan knew the fight was far from over. Eloria leaned on him for support, her silver skin dulled but her resolve unshaken. "The Nexus is restored," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But the Force will not stop. It will regroup, and its next attack will be even greater." Ethan nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Then we have to finish this. No more running or defending. We take the fight to it." Eloria's gaze met his, a flicker of admiration in her glowing eyes. "You've come far, Ethan. When I first met you, I wasn't sure if you were ready for this. Now, I see you are exactly who the crystal chose you to be." Ethan felt a mix of pride and fear. He didn't feel like a hero, but he couldn't deny the connection he now felt to the crystal and to Eloria. "What do we do?" he asked. "How do we stop the force for good?" Eloria straightened, summoning her strength. "The force's core resides in the void between our worlds. It has used the imbalance to anchor itself, feeding on fear and chaos. But now that the nexus is restored, we can sever its connection." "And how do we do that?" Ethan asked, his fingers tightening around the fragments. Eloria stepped toward the glowing stone circle. "The nexus can open a direct path to the void. We will face the force at its source and destroy it. But be warned, once we enter, there is no guarantee we will return." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. "If it means saving both our worlds, I'm in." Eloria nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "Then let us end this." She raised her hands, and the nexus began to glow brighter. The stones around them trembled, and a swirling portal formed at the center of the circle. It was different from the previous portals. Darker, more unstable, as if the void itself resisted their entry. Ethan took a deep breath, stepping beside Eloria. "Together," he said. "Together," she replied. They stepped into the portal, and the world around them dissolved into a swirling storm of light and shadow. The air was heavy, pressing against them like an invisible weight. Ethan gripped the fragments tightly, their glow cutting through the darkness. In the distance, a massive, shifting form loomed, a writhing mass of shadows and tendrils, pulsing with malevolent energy. The force's core. Ethan's chest tightened at the sight of it, but he forced himself to stand tall. "This is it," Eloria said, her voice steady. "The source of all the destruction." The force seemed to sense their presence, its tendrils writhing more violently. A guttural voice echoed through the void, deep and menacing. "You dare to challenge me in my domain?" Ethan stepped forward, the fragments glowing brighter in his hands. "Yeah, I dare. Your time is up." The force roared, its tendrils lashing out. Eloria raised her hands, summoning a barrier of light that deflected the attack. "Ethan, the crystal's power can destabilize it. Focus on the core." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. He raised the fragments, their energy surging through him. A beam of light shot toward the core, striking it and sending ripples through its massive form. The force howled, its shadows thrashing wildly. The void seemed to tremble as Ethan poured all his focus into the crystal. The fragments pulsed with energy, their glow intensifying. Eloria stood beside him, her own power amplifying the attack. Together, their combined energy pushed back the shadows, piece by piece. But the force wasn't giving up. Its tendrils lashed out again, striking the barrier and cracking it. Eloria gasped, her strength waning. "Ethan, you must finish it." Ethan gritted his teeth, his determination solidifying. He stepped forward, the fragments glowing brighter than ever. "This is for my world." "And yours," he said, his voice filled with resolve. With a final surge of energy, the fragments released a blinding wave of light that engulfed the core. The force let out a deafening scream as its form disintegrated, the shadows dissolving into nothingness. The void began to collapse, the heavy darkness lifting. Ethan turned to Eloria, who smiled weakly. "It is done," she said, her voice faint. The portal back to the nexus opened, its light warm and inviting. Ethan helped Eloria to her feet, and together they stepped through. The familiar field greeted them, the stone circle glowing softly in the morning sunlight. Ethan looked at Eloria, his heart heavy with exhaustion but filled with hope. "We did it," he said. She nodded, her smile brighter now. "The balance is restored, thanks to you." As the sun rose over the horizon, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. The fight was over, but the bond between their worlds, and between him and Eloria, was just beginning.